You've landed on The Substance, a podcast aimed at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. You usually will join us here every other week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I am your host, Philip Marinello, and this week we're doing something a little bit different. The last couple weeks have been so very hectic with work and with family. We had to travel for a family funeral, and literally on the day where we were coming back to Kansas City, we got news that there would be another family funeral that we needed to attend. So things have been very hectic in the Marinello household. It's not been bad, it's just been busy. So what we have for you this week is a replay of one of, it might actually probably still be, our most downloaded episode. This was from a while ago. It was in the 50s. I believe it was 56. Bradley Mason. This was our fastest episode to 1,000 downloads. We weren't chasing the hot topic, but it was something that we wanted. We kind of saw the way the conversation was going, get ahead of it. Things have kind of shifted slightly, but I feel like it's still a very relevant episode in kind of the way some of the culture war folks, the tactics are the same. Maybe CRT isn't quite the hot button issue as it once was, but I mean, this type of the model that was used in the quote unquote CRT controversy was being used now on other things. So thought it was relevant. Maybe if you've joined us here the last year or two, maybe you haven't gone back and listened. So wanted to replay this one for you as I take a little bit of time and write up some plans. I've got a lot of great guests on the schedule for the future. Got a couple plans with Substantive Cinema. Don't want to announce anything 100% until it's ready, but we are working on a number of exciting things. So going to take a couple weeks, replay some excellent episodes from the library. We got over 150 of them. So that's what we got for you this week. If you like the show and you haven't yet, one of the best ways that you can help support the show is by going to iTunes or Spotify, hitting the 5-star. And if you have Apple, even while you're listening now, just hit the button for the show, go write a couple sentences, write one sentence, say, hey, I like the show because blank. You can do that while you're listening, as long as you're not operating a motor vehicle. But yeah, that really helps us join. And reminder that Editor Dave is exiting the show. We greatly appreciate his service over the last year. He is pursuing more education and is just busy and is unable to do it. So if you want to give a little bit to Editor Dave so that we can give him a nice little thank you, you can hit us on CashApp at $thesubstancepod. And we'll be shooting that over to Editor Dave. Greatly appreciate everything he's done. I can get great guests to agree to talk to me. I can record a great show, but we wouldn't have that without him. So greatly appreciate what he's done for us here. So if you want to do that, that's the way to do that. And as always, share the show with folks. We always appreciate that. And if you do, tag us so that we can see it. We like to say thank you to the folks who do that. So without further ado, here is one of, if not still, the number one listened to episode of The Substance, our conversation with our internet pal, Bradley Mason. And this week we are joined by special guest, Bradley Mason. Bradley is a writer, and as you've seen online, he is in fact also a carpenter. Welcome, Bradley, to The Substance.
Yeah, it's true. Glad to be here. Thank you.
So what do you make, Bradley?
Mainly I own a custom cabinet shop. So whole house cabinetry, mainly doing just drafting, sales, things like that. So
is that local or do you ship nationally?
It's pretty local. So we're kind of in the Central Valley in California, and then most of the work's over on the Bay Area, West Coast. So
very nice. Well, I was going to say, well, if you want to advertise on a podcast, I know a guy, but I don't know if our California audience is significant enough to warrant that investment yet. I mean, we got people listening there, but
shout out to all the Californians.
All right.
So how do you get from drafting cabinets to drafting massive essays on sociological theories of some cultural import?
Well, I generally have enjoyed writing for a long time and just decided, I don't know, some years back, maybe 8 years back, to start writing again, doing some blog work, things like that. So I've enjoyed it ever since college, even before. I've liked writing. Studied philosophy in college, so wrote a lot about that for a long time. And then since that, kept studying. And then, of course, probably over the last 5 years, really started to dig into the history of race and racism in America and all the subjects connected with that. And that was, quite eye-opening and very energizing, mixed, including anger and many other strong motivating factors, which really put me to work studying and writing a lot more, I would say.
Wow.
On that note, I'm curious because we've been reading your stuff for a while. What were I don't know if there was just one inciting incident, but what were some of the circumstances that caused you to take a more critical look at history and claims of various oppressed groups and things like that?
I think probably a lot of it was early on. Okay, so I used to read occasionally Reformed African American Network.
Okay.
So
which became The Witness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I used to read that on and off, and I thought, oh, this is great. This perspective. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I'm glad the perspective's out there, and wanted to support them and things like that. And then I also then, oddly enough, it sounds almost absurd to say it now, had the expectation that most Reformed people agreed with me, that was good content, and and then
you would think,
yeah, that's what I assumed. And then specifically, Lex Lutheran on Twitter. You don't follow him?
Not familiar.
Great guy.
Should follow.
He started pressing me in direct messages to oh, okay, so Reformed Church is good on this. So what are they writing about it? How have they addressed this? How have they addressed that? And I started digging. Couldn't really find anything. Started to find the exact opposite of what I hoped to find. Started to realize there was a tremendous problem. More I dug into that, then I wanted to know personally. So then I started really studying history, studying, a little more on sociology, working out in that area. And then I realized that I had no idea what I was talking about, and that I was on the wrong side of the discussion myself. And so that just created a period of introspection and deep study and realizations and talking with a lot of people, and eventually started writing on the subject more broadly. But then, as you know, over probably the last few years, the critical race theory in particular, although it was just critical theory or a lot of other confusing ways of describing it early on. Yeah,
cultural Marxism.
With the word critical.
Cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism, yeah. Obviously, pretty quickly, anything you're saying on the subject is being attacked as culturally Marxist or something in that realm. And at first, I just thought, okay, I knew some critical theory, especially from philosophy days. Habermas more than anyone, from sort of philosophy of language, and then some Marcuse from political philosophy. So I had an idea of what I had studied Marxism, so I knew Marxism fairly well. I don't want to say that because a real traditional Marxist would blow me out of the water, but understood it broadly enough.
Relative to the audience that typically invokes the name.
Right. Yeah, I would say that. And then critical theory, and then I sort of just thought race was just added on, just, using the tools of critical theory to talk about race. And so at the time, that's kind of what I thought it was. But then the more I started looking into it, I realized it was something else entirely. In fact, significantly better than I thought, because I wasn't a big fan of critical theory proper. And once I started to see the roots of critical race theory within traditional Black abolitionist and civil rights discourse, then I could kind of see the continuity, going all the way back to David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, all the way through even to Dr. King and the Black Power movement. Now I could see the continuity and see that really critical race theory was not part of some, European tradition, starting with Marxism, going through Gramsci, going through the Frankfurt School, and then somehow addressing race. That really it was the traditional Black abolitionist and civil rights discourse that had sort of adapted some of these critical tools from critical legal studies in order to address the same topics that have been addressed for hundreds of years. So once I sort of saw it in that light, then I began to understand it as something distinct and, quite a bit more useful and much more easy to defend, I would say, in the end, than just critical theory proper, which everyone thought critical race theory was, I think, at the time. Just Frankfurt School with some race mixed in.
So I'm picking up a lot of this, but if you could just kind of distill it for the listener who's certainly not read all this stuff, what are the most important things to understand historically when people are throwing all these labels at? What is the historical reality and why is that important?
Related to critical race theory or?
Yes. Like the fact that it existed before, like why is that important?
Okay. Well, I can see, because coming from my perspective, I believe in my own life, I had sort of a social philosophy that I had developed that I believed was normal, natural, Christian, right? Which I know now was really just, part of my own upbringing and the society that I was born into, and being a white male middle class had more to do with my social philosophy than did the Bible or it just being common sense or something like that. So
that's right.
So many of the things I started to come across directly would contradict sort of my given man-made social philosophy, which, of course, in many cases feels like it's an attack on your theology and many other things, but of course, subsequently you learn it isn't. And one of those major things was simpler things like, growing up, you think that racism is, personal prejudice only, or that you hate someone because of the color of your skin, or even that you allow race to figure into any type of decision making. All of those things, that's the racism.
We've heard a sermon or two about that.
Right.
Yeah. But as you go back into actual abolitionist civil rights history, you see a very different explanation consistently throughout. Consistently, which is that what came first was the exploitation of people groups. Then comes the division based upon constructed racial categories. Then comes all of the ideas and stereotypes and assumptions of inferiority that are folded into that new racial caste system that's created. Then comes racism as the justification for what one has already done, right? And so you see this even explained quite clearly by Martin Luther King Jr. himself, who says that it seems that whenever people have engaged in great evil for a long period of time, they necessarily have to come up with a system, a scheme to justify their behavior. And that's really what he says racism was. So just that kind of flip, something like that, which is not at all created by critical race theory. Like I say, it goes back to in early 19th century. You can already start reading this idea of people understanding. And then also when you study the laws and the colonies and development of the United States and the construction of our government, you see that that's absolutely what happened. That is the case. So something like that really started to show me that, what some of these critical race theorists are saying now is that's not the crazy part, if there is a crazy part, because that's old, right? That's traditional. That's part of the discourse for quite a long time. It's not a part of white discourse, that's for sure. It's not a part of conservative Christian discourse, that's for sure. Right. So then you start to separate out what is it about that I'm reading critical theory that feels like an attack on my worldview almost, though I don't think it's that, or my social philosophy, or it feels like an attack on my theology, or on my general understanding of how the world works. It feels like it's coming from critical race theory, but the more you look into it, the more you realize, no, it's just it's an entirely different understanding of what racism is, how it functions, and how it was developed, and what it means historically, right? That I'm really reacting to. And I can't blame that on critical race theory on any new ideas.
And I wanted to just interact with that for a second too, because that was something, I think we've maybe said this before, but what you're saying essentially, racism isn't essentially first hatred. There is greed first. And what's interesting is that if you look at Leviticus, if you look at of people out there, even the colorblind folks out there on other podcasts that would say, "Oh, we don't see race, and the real problem is partiality." Mm-hmm. Okay, but then if you look at partiality in the Bible, one, it's systemic typically, and two, it's motivated by greed.
Yeah,
it's motivated by the possibility to economically exploit the vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that's why you have the laws about the justices in Leviticus not taking advantage and doing justice for the widow and the orphan, those who are marginalized. So what's sad is, like, you're saying that these are not ideas that are
they're not on the edge or in any way contradictory to faith.
The fact that they're not mainstream ideas within conservative Christianity is not an indictment on the ideas. It's actually an indictment on conservative Christianity because the ideas are biblical.
Right.
Well, wasn't that Robert P. Jones? Because we've done a couple different books, wasn't it? No, it was Daniel Hill talking about. He used the example of how white supremacy is the parasite that attached itself to American evangelicalism, right?
That's right.
And it has evolved over the years. It has shifted where it needed to and adapted to the point where it sounds like a wild thing to say if you've never thought of it before, but how, like, white supremacy is kind of like enmeshed within conservative evangelicalism in this country.
Yeah. And the difficulty that I have in this kind of discourse, and to some degree, is in certain circles, I feel that as a Black man existing in evangelical circles, I have to capitulate, or I have to be silent in the sense of just, don't talk about the heavy stuff, don't talk about critical race theory. And it's like, we all know that something doesn't have to directly happen to you in order for you to care. There's so many things that we have outreach for and care for, and so many things we could bring out. And so I have Black brothers and sisters that I know of, and then obviously the stories that we've heard, who are truly experiencing a reality of this system, of this institution of racism, and its fruits all the way from the early 19th century all the way until now. Right. And so that difficult position that then I have is like, well, do I speak up but cause trouble, or do I keep quiet for the sake of the body? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And just to add on to that sort of self-censoring, that, pressure to assimilate in certain ways. I was reading an essay recently by Devin Carbato and Cheryl Harris, and they were explaining how institutions, and I can apply this to the church, certain institutions, when they create a sort of a colorblind ethic, right, as a standard, then that kind of exerts its own racial preference system. Right? So you think colorblindness eliminates a racial preference system, but it actually imposes one, because it causes people, especially racialized minorities, to self-censor, to leave out portions that are integral to their own identity, their own life experiences, how they understand the world. So white people can freely express all of those things because that's considered normal, natural, just part of the way the world is. But when you impose colorblindness, then you have to take people who have different minoritized, racialized experiences, and they're required to self-censor, not tell their whole story, not put their whole self out there, not let themselves be known in entirety. And so something like a colorblind standard in an institution itself becomes a racial discriminatory preference in bringing people in.
Yeah. You literally make it so that it is like you can't bring it up, or else you're. I mean, how many times have we heard that?
Well, and I was literally just having a conversation with a friend. We were talking about this, and he was like, "The Bible has to inform my identity." This was his articulation of colorblindness as a theology and as an approach. Was like, well, the Bible has to inform my identity and my ideology, so it has to inform theirs too. We all just kind of gather around in the church around the Bible. And so, it's not about their blackness or my whiteness. It's just about, Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you want the whole person engaged. I think that's kind of what I'm pointing out. So in the article, they use an example of when you're applying to a college and you write an essay to try to tell your story. And those are pretty important in being accepted. Now, what if you're supposed to understand that it's illegal to take race into account? when reading these, right? Or in choosing the people, candidates to accept to the college. So you're going to then have to select out things that might be integral components to why you're so perfect for this institution, or all of the great things that you can offer it, because you have, different life experiences that aren't common, or all those things have to be deleted, which could easily lead to a person's rejection, right? Because they haven't been able to actually tell their story.
Yeah.
So
and that's what we're doing in churches.
Personhood is not fully on display because of the censorship required by a colorblind standard, if that makes sense. And I think that operates within, churches as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, one of the things, as you talk about these things, you cited Carbato, and you talking about these articles, these things you've read. There's a lot of folks out there speaking on these issues. And and a lot of times folks who are confused, because they're looking at this and they're like, well, yeah, you want me to read your guy saying this, but my guy over here is saying this.
Right.
But what's missing maybe there is a discussion on the importance of sourcing and reading things in context. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that's driven your work and why that's so important to you?
Yeah, I think part of it could just be that's the way that I learn things, right? So if you told me about an idea, whatever the name of it was, the first thing I would want to know is, where did it come from? How far back do I need to go? What were the precursors? I don't really understand things otherwise. Like, I just don't learn that way. I took physics classes. It was fine. I could memorize the formulas. But after I left the class, I want to know where they came from. So then I read a history of the development of physics, and now I understood the principles. So that could have just something to do with the way I personally learn. I don't know that everyone learns that way. So for me, if I want to know what critical race theory, I want to know where it came from, right? How it developed, what was its meaning, what was the purpose, and I try to sort of write in that same manner as well, so that when a person's sort of following the conversation, then when they get to the ideas that are central to critical race theory, it's no longer like a shocker, like, oh, that came out of left field. No, it's highly motivated if you tell the whole story. So I tend to think in those terms, and that's kind of why I gravitate towards as many of the earliest sources as possible. But I've also, with Nathan Cartagena, we've been writing this little series, and we've also been talking about in there how there is something about the core of critical race theory that is a legal theory and is connected with judicial ideology, legislative, some in that core. We're talking about law. It came out of law schools. It was lawyers who wrote it, law professors, and that there is a reason for that it's not just arbitrary. It happened to spring up there, but because race was constructed by law. It was the privileges and advantages and disadvantages were distributed by law. Sort of law is kind of central to the way racism is built into American society and in the way that race is constructed. So for sure. I think that that's really the core of critical race theory. And as soon as you start to walk outside of there, in a sense, you're making new applications. You're being selective in making applications. And that's where Nathan talks about from Edward Said about traveling theory. So you can have a core idea or a theory, and then as it gets applied in different disciplines, right, and in different fields, then of course there's a different application that's made there, and there are certain tenets and ideas that are more applicable in others than art, right? So now you've kind of traveled out into a wider sphere, and now it often still carries the same name. So a good example would be traveling into education, critical race theory in education. And it's sort of a different thing. Like Solorzano would say, okay, these are some tenets from critical race theory, which are particularly helpful and applicable in education, right? But we would take them to be kind of like this. And then he'll do CRT in education. But you see, you've already traveled. You've made a modification. You've kind of moved it out to another level, right? So I even feel like when you get into those realms outside, even sociology, I would say, you still have to be going back to sort of the center of the theory to even understand how the applications work within those other disciplines, right?
Yeah.
So for me, when I hear something, when there's a discussion of critical race theory, I have to take it back to what is that core? And some people, I don't know, Helen Pluckrose recently told me, well, that's like ancient CRT, right? Not modern.
Yeah.
And it's like ancient, like, I've talked to these people. They're alive and well. They're still the core of the field. They're still writing. They're still the professors that are teaching the people. It's not some sort of ancient history. It's just that we've taken traveled theories as the core, right? Because a lot of them are more easily problematized for culture war endeavors. Which then would be, of course, sort of the widest sphere of them all. That now you've taken it from its central discipline, adapted it for other disciplines, and now the culture warriors have just taken pieces from that outer layer to construct something entirely new.
Yeah.
And now that's where the debate's happening, and it's working in my mind.
Well, yeah, and that's where you see these name games going on, right? And I know we want to stick to ideas, but some main proponents of these ideas, like Neil Shinvey, in his paper, he talks about contemporary critical theory. So, like, there's a shift. And
or
then,
the critical social justice. Like, he's just always trying to change the labels.
With Vadi Bakum, right? And his Fall Lines book. So, like, you never actually arrive at, and then when they struggle with the definition, they'll put it back on the theory, like, well, the theory's hard to define because it's relative in the truth. And it's like, that doesn't seem fair.
Bradley's written a lot. One of the things I'll put in the show notes, your, I guess, critique of the intro of Fault Lines was just kind of wild to read. I have no intention of reading the book, but just seeing the stuff he said, I was like, I don't have a fraction of Bradley's critical scholarly background, but I'm like, that's not how, like, concepts work.
Well, and that's not how your high school English teacher would allow you to do sourcing.
Right.
No.
Not to be insulting, but just to be fair. That's a real description, right?
Yeah, I don't think you have to be insulting to note that is an immoral use of sources, right?
Yes.
It's similar to a lie, to a trick, to a sham.
Mm-hmm.
That's really
whether it's intentional or not, right?
To me, it is immoral, right?
Yeah.
It's lying. I don't know how to understand it any other way. When you claim you're referring to source material, which you have completely changed, taken parts out, you put things in quotes that were never really there. You say something is sourced from something that it's actually not. These are mistakes that a high school teacher would catch, but also when you're engaging in a culture war where you're going to attack fellow brothers and sisters in the faith by means of this, what you've now used is subterfuge and trickery and lies to accomplish that. So to me, it's immoral to use sources in that way, not just erroneous, in my opinion.
Yeah,
man.
I think that's a huge dimension that as believers, the Lord has a way that He would require us to approach truth. That has to do that in faithfulness, and it's right to call each other to that standard. And it doesn't mean we're always going to get it perfect. People can make honest mistakes, but we have to be I think that there's a part where they would say, well, we can overwrite these mistakes because the character of these people, the importance of the culture war, the goodness of the truth, and these are enemies of the truth. So I'm actually characterizing them faithfully in my conception of them. But the problem is it's a circular argument because the whole point is to prove that they are the enemy, or that they are spouting ideas that are dangerous to the Bible.
And if there ever was a Bolshevism, that's it.
Explain.
The ends justify the means, that it's the cause justifies, whatever chicanery has to happen in the process, whatever has to be ignored. You can use, falsehoods as long as it promotes the greater quote unquote truth. It's many of the same things that critical race theorists are being accused of is being employed by them in this culture war.
So in other words, what you're saying is when we engage in a fear-mongering or a fear-based rhetoric that is kind of driven by this slippery slope, we actually become these out-of-control revolutionaries in the way that we handle truth, that we're trying to warn against.
Right. So it's okay that all these things are false, right? Because they're promoting a greater truth, right?
The greater good.
That's what that's what Stalin would say as well.
Ooh,
so
yeah.
Which is hilarious if it wasn't so damaging people in the pews and just tarnishing the gospel witness on a public stage on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. And what's wild is the greater truth, obviously, is not something they're presenting, if you can think about it this way. Okay, so if you're presenting a greater truth, you would present that by lots of smaller truths. Okay?
Right.
But if you're presenting a greater truth and you don't have lots of smaller truths, in fact, a lot of chicanery and falsehoods, then to my lights, what you're doing is you're appealing to what everyone wants to be the greater truth. Okay? So I don't think that someone like Vaughty Baucham is creating and promoting the message, but rather appealing to what people want to be the message or what they already hold to, or right. So that's so much of what this culture war is that it's appealing to the sentiments that people already have. I just, from my lights, we're just in a full scale backlash, a period of retrenchment, just like there was following the civil rights movement, is where we're at. So people are hungry for these arguments in order to defeat the racial opponents. Is kind of where we're at right now.
And that kind of goes along with what Jamar Tisby was saying, was that this is a new era in the civil rights movement, and it's so heartbreaking and just kind of flabbergasting to me as somebody who, if you just have eyes, you don't need to be a historian to just kind of generally see there are people who have advantages, and you can get spun out. You can have your favorite conservative pundit get you all amped up, oh, they're trying to take your advantages away. But no, if you're a person who claims that your primary identity is that of a follower of Christ, justice matters. And rather than your social leg up. And it seems like the people are defending their social leg up over actual justice, when Trevor and I have had conversations with one of the guys who's leading that charge. And he verbally said to us, the big bad, the thing he is fighting against, is eventual anti-white racism. And it's I was stunned. I didn't know what to say.
So the exact quote was, if you believe that systemic racism exists in America today, you are on a slippery slope to believing that white people are evil because of the color of their skin.
And that is why his whole charge exists. And I was I wanted to laugh and cry.
That was the response to the civil rights movement too.
Yeah.
Identical response to the civil rights movement. Precise, word for word. That's why I say over and over again, these people would be as mad at the civil rights movement as they would critical race theory. And the things they hate about critical race theory is what they hate about the civil rights movement. Period.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Because there is a discipleship. There is a faith tradition, in a sense,
a historical line,
a way that has been handed down at looking at these things. We don't realize we've been handed it, but we have been brought up in a certain way of viewing politics and society and culture and our birthright and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And by necessity, these things are traditions and not necessarily all of them grounded in scripture
or truth.
And so we have to keep reforming.
That's why I am constantly pushing that notion to try and distinguish the ideas you have, the social philosophy that you have, from the theology that you've developed, because it's historic, it's contingent, it was created by men. We can follow out its history. It doesn't exist everywhere on the earth now. It doesn't even exist in every Western society now, these specific set of ideas. It won't be found if you go back to Europe prior to coming to America. It's something specific that we believe that is contingent, historically created, and man-made. And because it becomes such a basic tool in our understanding the world, understanding why I have things and other people don't, and why that's okay was a major one. All of this is something that seems completely natural, completely normal, to the point where when it's questioned, then you're attacking God, you're attacking my theology, you're attacking the fundamentals, when really it's something that can be disentangled from that and should be.
If you just give a teeny bit of effort. I am listening to the audiobook now of Color of Law. I just learned that Kansas City stopped using near explicit segregation laws for housing in 1987.
Right.
That's when segregation language stopped being used in our city for house zoning, which goes to wealth, which goes to education, which goes to proximity to medical treatment, and all these things. Like
social networks,
that stopped happening 30 years ago.
Yeah. And then if you're unwilling to carry out any race-conscious remedies,
right,
then basically you're now preserving that system actively.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to jump into that because we've talked about these ideas broadly, but I wanted to kind of attack two different ideas. One of them is I wanted to have you do it, Bradley. So one of them is kind of related to the stuff that Philip was just talking about. I'll call it out, and we can link this paper. We've linked it before. Shenvi's Engaging Critical Theory in the Social Justice Movement. And one of the things that's very pivotal to his argument happens on page 12 of that. And he kind of talks about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and he says it effectively ends Jim Crow, and then he stops the history of civil rights there.
Right.
And I think that's a very important choice, and I've seen to a man every single one of the folks who are on the anti-woke train do this. They have a historical assertion that the civil rights struggle achieved what it was trying to achieve pretty much in total in 1964 and 65.
Right.
It was a success. Mission accomplished.
Interact with that as a historical proposition.
Well, I would say that obviously that's absolutely false. You just have to read Dr. King to know that. The last, 3-4 years of his life after the 64 civil rights package was passed, he realized that not only was it not being enforced, but the very spirit of the law was beginning to already be lost on Americans as part of retrenchment. So that was seen pretty much immediately. And I think what you have, and I've tried to write about, is coming out of the civil rights movement. Okay, so during the civil rights movement, going back to 54, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and long before that, going all the way back even to the Reconstruction Acts following the Civil War, you sort of have this tension that's kind of already existing within the law, where you have an ideal of granting formal equality, right? So you create equality of opportunity, and then that formalized equality then is the solution. But in both the Civil Rights Acts, 64, 65, and in Brown versus Board of Education, and in the Reconstruction packages and amendments that were passed after the Civil War, it was very clear that the intention of all of those was to remedy the circumstances that had been created for African Americans. I mean, they're very specific. If you look at the slaughterhouse cases, Stoddard, like that's way back. And they're making very clear that, okay, the intention of the Reconstruction laws and the amendments was to restore African Americans in American society to the place where they had been if this had never occurred to them to begin with. And then we see that reiterated even in the 1964 Civil Rights Package. Congress had spoken very clearly that the intention of this was to make it such that they had never experienced this before, that they not only are given just the right to have opportunities, but are given the very opportunities that they have a right to. We see this in LBJ's speech that I believe he gave at Howard at the time, where he gave the example of the runners, right? So if you're going to have a race, and then you have a group of runners who had shackles on their whole lives, now you took the shackles off and you put them in line and you said, okay, now race. have you actually created equality? So the purpose was greater than that, even at that time. And you can see that even in the Title VII requirements, and right away after the Civil Rights Movement, you can even see that the courts at the time, the Supreme Court even shared that understanding of the intention of civil rights law. If you look at Griggs versus Duke Power in particular, where he was an employer who had discriminated legally, right, prior to 1964. Mm-hmm. And then that law is passed. And so what he did instead is he created a test, a written test that had to be taken by employees. And then after that, so now it's illegal in 1965 and beyond to discriminate, but he had the exact same situation of employment. So this exact same discriminatory circumstances existed at his firm, meaning there was the same number of black versus white people working there, and that white people had all the good positions, and right, just the same exact racial stratification of that business that existed when it was legal to discriminate now existed when it was illegal to discriminate, right? And so what the court had required at the time was that it was on him to justify the use of that test, that he needed to show that there was an overriding purpose that directly related to the employment requirements to justify the disparate impact that resulted from that test. Okay? Mm-hmm. That was understood to be the principle of Title VII in 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we do see that present. This is understood. But as quick as that decision is made, the retrenchment begins, right? And, and then what the civil rights package ends up doing then is, if you took that same case with Griggs, because you have many cases that were just like that, but now have it go the other way. So you have this one stratification, racial stratification within the business prior to the civil rights law, and then you have the exact same thing afterwards. What's the difference? Oh, it's illegal to discriminate, and we as a business do not discriminate. Okay, well then I guess it's just that some people work harder than others, some people are more or less intelligent, right? So now the exact same racial stratification, the exact same disparate impact in the exact same business is now legitimated by the very laws that were intended to erase that, right?
Wow.
So,
wow.
That's what happened. That's what happened quickly. That's what ultimately leads to people like Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, and then their students creating a critical theory of race, because they're taking that earlier understanding of the civil rights movement and its intentions, which is to change the subordinated circumstances of people of color in the United States, and react to how quickly it became a colorblind, equal opportunity means equal treatment sort of system that served to justify the disparities that always existed. And that's what it is right now today. It functions in very much the same way. I was talking to someone today and making the argument, he said, oh, well, we know that racism, active racism in the past is what created a lot of the disparities, but we know it's not active racism now that's doing that, right? And that's what I'm told. Okay.
Oh, man.
So not only is there just a lot of active racism, but we can think of it a quick, easy, and extremely common active racism. And that's one where you say the racial disparities in this country are a result of inferior behaviors and cultures of minoritized people. Okay, That's racist. That's racist. And then when you take that and you oppose policies and you oppose remedies and anything to it that could possibly address these disparities actively, then you're actively racist. And that is common culture-wide racism on an individual level, not just systemic, right?
And that's what we hear all the time.
And
people saying, like,
supported.
Well, you hear a lot of people saying, in person and online, I don't know how many times we've heard people saying this, is that, like, I don't want to be punished for the sins of my forefathers, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, we want you guys to be cognizant of and repentant of, where necessary, your active or past,
it's right now.
Your active support of
I'm
these
not
racist
guilty of the sins of my fathers. No, we're not saying you are.
No, you're guilty of yours.
We're saying you're a son of your father.
Yeah.
That's
you
different.
uncritically took in a lot of things.
It's a fundamentally different argument.
And I've again, I've talked to people
it's the same argument Jesus used in Matthew 23,
who put themselves back in either the civil rights movement or in the abolition period as if they would be on the right side. And it's like literally 100% of your argumentation is on the other side, but you're like, well, obviously slavery was bad. Obviously people who oppose civil rights are bad. But like now I'm just carrying forward all those things.
It was evangelicals who opposed slavery. What about William Wilberforce? And it's like, name one Southern Baptist or Southern Methodist or Southern Presbyterian pastor or leader in the 1800s. Name one who was abolitionist staunchly and forthrightly. Mm-hmm. Name one. I'll wait.
And ask Wilberforce about Haiti.
Ooh.
And when England was trying to expand their interests into the Caribbean after they had gotten rid of slavery even, and were trying to negotiate that by means of suggesting to the planters that they could continue enslaving if they gave them power. So I mean, even that, you gotta temper it all. There, even the abolitionist movement contained a lot of white supremacy.
Yes.
And that's not just to blow up everyone in the past to say that we're better now. It's just to recognize what is the case, to not, founder on the same rocks. So, and then to your point, more often than not, when you hear in the churches, they say, we condemn racism, right? We're all of one blood, right? And, they make all of these arguments, and you don't hate anyone based upon their skin color. And then they describe something that I can literally read Thornwell or Dabney writing. Yep.
Yes.
Because that wasn't the basis of racism even then. They weren't polygenicists. They didn't believe that there was, separate creations for different races. They just believed in monogenesis, just like we do, right? They believe that everyone came from Adam. But most of them believe that over time something happened to different groups of people that set them behind and then created a hierarchy, whether it's weather, right, or the climate part of the globe, or just long-term divergence of people groups that led to superior and inferior, or extremely common, and we see this weaponized against the Native Americans, is the idea of having civilization, having achieved civilization, as opposed to not having achieved civilization, right? And then we want to think we're so advanced, right?
Right.
But we are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When we talk about inferior cultures, we're talking about lack of civilization according to our standards that justify, right, the disparate outcomes that happen, that justify the exploitation of people, that justify thinking of them as inferior. So I think that so many of the things that are taken to be an opposition to racism today are things that many, even slave owners, would have been pretty comfortable agreeing with. So it's not setting anyone apart, not even minimally.
Man. No. All we've done, and this is what's interesting. So it's not that, and a lot of people get these arguments wrong, that even that you're making right now, it's not that we're saying there was no racial progress made. It's that we're saying alongside anti-racist progress, there was racist progress that was made.
Right.
And so, yes, there were increased opportunities for Black America on paper, and in some cases in reality.
Right.
But at the same time, what you just described was we added a layer of self-deception on what the nature and characteristics of racism even were, such to the extent that unless we challenge that self-deception, we can't even engage with the racism that actually exists in our society as a church.
Right. Yep. And I mean, that relates directly to, the racial reform, racial retrenchment understanding within critical race theory, that is sort of a historical dialectic, that progress is always met with some form of ideological backlash, right? And that's kind of what we were talking about coming out of the civil rights movement. And I don't know about you guys, but I can see it in my own life that, growing up with an analytic of what race is, that was basically just white liberals absorbing the civil rights message and making it pedestrian and non-radical, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of completely removing its edge, is what many of us grew up with. And then that sort of other black nationalisms, or some of the other competitors that were more popular with the citizenry than were sort of the white progressive reinterpretation of the civil rights movement, then becomes a clash. And you can see how one side won out big time, like we just talked about, within the course of about 10 years, probably.
Clearly.
I mean, you have Nixon essentially taking the language of Barry Goldwater, who essentially took the language of George Wallace from his campaign in Alabama, right?
Yep. And which you can go listen to on YouTube.
Yeah, it's not old.
Yep.
And it's become now the predominant narrative and discourse on civil rights movement. Somehow George Wallace wins by just taking out some of the color conscious language. You know what I mean? And America as a whole is like just pulled their left foot out of the other side in 1964, and now is looking at disparities and saying, you guys need to get your act together.
Wow.
Right then and there, that the very movement that was intended to bring about the social change now becomes the justification for no change, right?
Wow.
The naturalization of it, the normalization of it, the legitimation of it. And then, so we have that whole new paradigm and analytic to look at racism that we're calling from the civil rights movement. And so many people believe it is, but it isn't at all.
Yeah.
And so then when you have critical race theorists, early ones, pushing back against that, then they're immediately accused of being against civil rights and against the civil rights movement. I mean, this is not new. They're saying it all right now, but they said it all the way back then, too, to Bell and to Crenshaw. She's already written about that within 10 years of the start of critical race theory back in the day. Yeah. Writing about how she's being accused of opposing the civil rights movement, which is patently absurd.
It's ludicrous.
Yeah.
But it's a predominant narrative today.
Mm-hmm. So Bradley, this is the reality we find ourselves in. How do we, for those of us that are seeking to engage and to cultivate a proper understanding of truth and historical realities, kind of seek to take down these lies? This is sin. This is injustice. This is wrong. This is something God hates. How do we seek to do that in a peaceable way?
Well, I've thought about this a lot, and I continue to, and I don't entirely know. I keep thinking about it, obviously prayerfully discussing it. It does seem like, when you're individually talking with someone, if they're at all willing to listen, you can start walking through some history. You can at least make some sense, right? Mm-hmm. Even if they oppose it. Sort of in the cultural realm, it's a lot more difficult because by and large, at that point, it has to do with resources and, platforms, and becomes complicated by all of those. Obviously, PragerU can just pump out those little videos. They spend millions of dollars creating, spread them all over the internet for everyone to see. It's hard to compete with that, right? At a direct level. Yeah. But I think obviously everyone just has to work within the area that they have, and as far as you can reach. Now, how you actually approach that becomes more difficult, because I'm constantly torn. Like, I want to defend like what critical race theory means, right? Mm-hmm. But then on the other hand, I also don't know that everyone needs to be reading critical race theory proper, right?
Right.
But it always seems like it's implied, when really I'm just trying to defend. No, that's not what it is, because it's being retooled as a weapon in the culture war, rather than what it is. So I think I'm sure you've all seen that Christopher Rufo pair of tweets, right, where he's explaining how you want to make the phrase critical race theory toxic, so that we can take everything we oppose and put it under that heading and discredit it, right?
Yep.
So that's
he's doing it.
So
it's working frustratingly
very
well.
Sad.
Oh yeah, yes. It's working so well that he can say it and it doesn't hurt it.
Right.
That's how well it hurt. So then I constantly am torn. Okay, there's a lot of things that they're saying are evil that I agree are evil, but they're just not critical race theory, and they're not what's part of the ethnic studies programs at any schools or anything. Just so much of that is made up, and I personally, I'm open to advice. Am not entirely positive how you attack that. Do you just fight to defend the clarity of a set of concepts, or do you? I'm reticent. There was one point at which I thought, okay, we can agree with the things that they oppose, since it's not critical race theory anyhow, right? And say, yeah, I do oppose that. But what you quickly see is that when that's part of a political methodology, then it just carries the same chilling effect that anything that can be associated with it then is that same evil thing in people's minds. So,
yeah,
I don't know. All I can imagine doing is, continuing to carefully explain things in the best way you can for people who want to listen. Maybe encourage some people that they don't have to know anything about critical race theory proper. They don't have to go read the law journal articles but the corollary of that is then chill out on freaking out about it being, the worst thing that ever happened to America.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't want to actually read it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I appreciate that.
And then third, I tend to point people that I don't think, want to read those tomes to people like Jamar Tisby, read Color of Compromise, read How to Fight Racism. Those are great books that are, I would say, largely consistent with a lot of the teachings of critical race theory, but aren't coming directly from the perspective of critical race theory.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And if that gets more traction and helps more people, then that's the direction I would
shout out to the folks in the audience who won our book and lecture series giveaway at the point that this airs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Shout out to Zondervan.
Yeah.
We gave away sets of his books and his video series. During the beginning of the pandemic, the Color of Compromise video series was free to stream on Prime. I think you can buy it now for like $12 or something. It's all there.
Yeah.
And as regards strategy, I think the last thing I'd say on that is ours is pretty straightforward. I mean, one is what they said in the Reformation ad fontes, to the sources.
Yeah.
We want people to deal with truth faithfully and biblically and in a way that is honoring to Christ, like we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. There is a right way and a wrong way to use and approach and quote sources. Yeah. And then the other thing that I would say is just showing people where ideas exist in the Bible, because you can't say that idea is inherently evil when it's but here's God saying it.
Right.
So,
that's why I always hit the identity. Yeah. It's if your primary identity is conservative, white, rich
redistribution
person,
is evil. Read Exodus.
Yeah.
Did you notice where God did it? So if it's inherently evil, then how is God, who is good, doing it?
Right. Right.
Who's your loyalty to?
Yeah. And what that does is I'm trying to expose tensions. You do believe in objective truth, right? So if we do, then we should be able to get at some things through sources. And you do believe in the Bible, right? That's your core identity, right?
Right.
Well, then you should identify more with the Bible than with this. And so I'm trying to drive a wedge. And this is, if anybody who's listening, who's against my ideas, this is my tactics. And the thing is, if I'm wrong, these tactics will fail.
Yeah, show us. With an argument, don't just say, we had a really long conversation with a guy. We're like, hey, if we're wrong, show us how and why. And it was just this is evil because it's evil and it's Marxist and it's evil.
And lots of people
That's not a very
Marxism.
Good, that's not an argument. That's a soundbite.
That's you're scared of stuff, the end.
Right. Yeah. And there is nothing, we have to be aware too, you constantly hear well, I don't need any of that because I have the Bible and that's all I need. Right.
Sure.
And that makes absolutely no sense. At all. Not even a little bit. No one actually lives that way.
Right.
No one. Yeah.
No one. Okay.
The Bible didn't teach you how to drive your car.
Yeah. That is not the intention. That's not what it's written for. Does it apply to all of these things? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All of them, top to bottom. So
it's pretty explicit
have to be able to make that distinction that okay, yes, the Bible doesn't teach me about racialization in America. right? Or the legal history that created these disparities. It doesn't teach me any of those. I cannot understand that just from reading the Bible, right?
Right.
But this is how we live. We have to learn. We have to exegete our own environments to apply the truths of the Bible. And that's what happens throughout the New Testament. Isn't that what Paul's doing? What is the author of the Hebrews doing except exegeting a situation and then applying the scripture, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're called to do.
Systematically.
That's basic biblical understanding is you have to not only exegete the scriptures, but exegete your own circumstances. You aren't going to know who the oppressed are or how to help the oppressed. You can't carry out the mandates of Jesus if you're too blind to your own personal environment and history to know who's who and what was going to help them. Right?
Man, that is a solid word right there, man. Well, 100%. Bradley, what? Tell me this. What do you do? We kind of want to get to the Bradley who is behind, when you take off the cape and you're not, just absolutely exposing strawman arguments. One of the things we like to ask our guests here is to shout out something that you've been reading or watching or listening to, just something you enjoy, either for spiritual benefit or intellectual benefit or just to unwind. What's something you've been enjoying recently?
I'm going to be straight honest, okay? I like watching TV.
There you go.
Okay. Watching TV with my wife in the evenings.
Any particular show y'all are enjoying?
It is. I like it. I mean, honestly, I try to read. I read when I can, but I do like sitting down. A new season of Alone started up. I like that.
What's that called?
Alone.
Alone.
Yeah.
They get dropped off out there in the woods, and got to stay alive. Yeah.
We shouted out a couple episodes back Dan Wowak, who was on season 4.
Oh, really?
And
Trevor's become like a survival guy in quarantine.
Yeah, dude, Alone is awesome, man.
I love it. Yeah.
So what else you got, Bradley?
Wow. Other things, I don't know. I like working out, CrossFit, fun.
Shout out to CrossFit.
I don't want to talk too much about that. That's kind of an embarrassing subject in a lot of circles.
Welcome to our CrossFit podcast.
Yeah. And
the substance of muscle.
Exactly. Anything I'm reading right now? Oh man, all the same, boring stuff that I've been reading. Lots of articles. I was just finishing up Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought. It's a great book. So I'm polishing that one right now.
Nice.
Kind of late to it, but it's been eye-opening, especially when you read a passage like when she says, people suggest that different identities have different oppressions associated that pile up and then therefore give that person a better understanding and a more stronger access to truth. And she says that's a Marxist idea that no one holds to. In critical race theory.
Says the critical race theorist feminist.
Yeah. So when I read that, I was like, okay, wow. Interesting. Nice. That even one of the main teachers of intersectionality thinks that their opponent's description is the one that's Marxist.
Yeah.
But anyhow, so that's three things. Do I need more?
Very good.
Dude, that's
hanging out with
funny.
Kids, barbecuing. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I appreciate the work.
Maybe that's what the truth is.
Well, no, your work is actually doing a lot. It's something that I was in a conversation with family members just yesterday and saying, you guys really ought to read Bradley Mason's stuff on this if you want a faithful Christian perspective who is going to cite sources in context, and as deep as you want to go, he'll go there with you. You can feel good about that you've engaged well in the topic versus just getting sound bites from culture warriors who maybe
don't know what they're talking about.
Well, and maybe ultimately don't have your best interests at heart. Like maybe they are after a certain platform or a certain influence that isn't necessarily about, your engagement with truth.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your work because it is pivotal.
And one encouraging thing I would say to anybody who will take the venture of reading Bradley's content is, I think for me, it has helped me be humble enough to expose my idols. And I think that's going to help a lot of different people. Just if there is something, whether it be politics or, like you guys said, sound bites, or a particular individual or groups of individuals that, and regardless of the side, it's going to, I think, require you to be humble enough to say, I think I worship that, or I've put that thing in place of Christ, and I ought to humble myself, I ought to repent and think differently.
Wow, that's great. Yep, that's great. That's what's happened in my studying.
Yeah.
Humbling, broke apart everything I thought was true for so many years, starting as the president of Young Republicans in high school.
Yeah,
year,
right.
You know?
Yeah.
You could list that on your CV for some of your hyper conservative. Like, no, it's okay. I was the president.
I was super white. That's good, man.
All right.
Well, Bradley, thanks so much for your time tonight. I really love what you've been doing. Love the time, and some good thoughts for people to chew on this. And
lastly, Bradley, where can people find you?
Oh, all things Also a Carpenter. So
okay.
AlsoACarpenter.com, also at Also a Carpenter, at Twitter, Facebook, Also a Carpenter.
There you go.
Pretty much that. Anywhere you look, that'll be me.
And if you're in California, we'll do it for free. If you're in California, get a cabinet.
Oh, yeah.
Tell them the Substance sent you.
That's right.
Free promo code.
This man does CrossFit, so you know he's ready.
Does CrossFit terribly.
But cabinets excellently.
Oh, definitely.
There's a tagline in there if we workshop it.
We're going to work on that. All right, man.
All right, thanks for your time, Bradley.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
All right, good night.
Peace.
That was great.
That was indeed great. And it was Bradley Mason.
Man, that was heady. That was probably our most academic. I was like, this is Trevor's ideal podcast. Like, it was like when we first had Brett or Alyssa on the show talking movies. I was like, this is my favorite. I could see Trevor just be like eating all this data up.
Talk to him about the Reconstruction.
Mr. Nine over here is
Talk to him about Title VII. Talk to him.
So if you are as enthralled as Trevor, maybe hit Trevor up. He's going to move. He needs more friends.
That's true.
That's going to be a great thing.
What
but
up, Boston?
If you appreciate what we're doing, if you like this show, one, tell a friend. Mm-hmm. Share this episode with some friends, whatever podcast app you're on. If you go to our Twitter and Instagram, we have a link that will open up our show in whatever platform is downloaded on your phone. So that's a great way if you want to send that link to your friends and family, or on your social media. That's also great. Or if you want to share this particular episode, please tag us in that, we would ask. And if you really like what we're doing and want to join us, you can join some of the folks in our audience who are supporting us, who are kicking in a little bit each month to help us out. You can do that at the anchor link in the show notes. There is $1, $5, and $10 options. Any and all are appreciated. We're working on a campaign, 21 in 21, to try to get 21 $5 a month supporters by the end of the year. And I'm saying right now, if people keep signing up at $10 a month, I'm loving it. If you want to sign up at 10, if you're able to.
Does that count for two?
Actually, like, people keep signing up. I'm like, should we go for $10 a month? Like, I'm usually the one saying aim high, but like, people's dollars and time is very valuable right now. So whatever you're able to sign up at, we genuinely appreciate you. We're getting a little bit built up, so hopefully, I don't know, we can maybe get a website going here sooner than later.
Yeah.
And then the other way is kind of just have an online tip jar at like one time. And a shout out to one of our listeners who's kind of using our Cash App as a monthly thing without the commitment. You can hit us at $thesubstancepod for individual donations. If you want to throw us a couple bucks here and there, or if you get a big fat paycheck and you're like, you know what, I love the substance. Or if you win one of our books or something like that and want to kick a little back to keep that going around to some of our other listeners, you can hit us at $thesubstancepod.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Substance Pod. Just like Phil said in our bio on Instagram and Instagram and Twitter, we have our unique link that is going to, just like Philip said, it's going to get you to your preferred podcast app to share and enjoy. And for you to subscribe, and also follow us on our social media so that you can be aware of our guests. You can be aware of the things that we're talking about, the things that we're reading, the things that our guests are getting involved in, as well as our giveaways. So if you want more content, in-depth content, or just to continue the conversation, follow us on our social media.
As you're engaging with us on social media, you're looking at the stuff that Bradley Mason wrote, you're listening to the podcast, getting ideas, you're writing stuff down, you can send us an email, interact with us at thesubstancepod@gmail.com. Or if you have testimonials, thoughts you want to share, just kind of your experience with the show, and you want to do that in a more personal way, you can hit us up on our phone line, which is 913-703-3883. Leave us a little message on there, and if it is really punchy, you could end up on the show. We appreciate you guys. Shout out to the Substance supporter that me and Philip met at church the other week. You know who you are. You rock. And we will see all of y'all next time
on The Substance.
Peace.
Do you watch any Chris Fowler's stuff, like Fowler's Makery of Mischief on YouTube ever?
No, I haven't.
He was the winner of season 4. He was out there 87 days.
Oh, I've seen him. Yeah, okay.
He's got all sorts of like really great videos. He's like a little videographer. He's kind of taking.